Welcome. I'm David Levi Strauss, chair of the MFA program in art writing here at the School of Visual Arts. Tonight we're pleased to have our own Emmanuel Iduma, graduate of the art writing program and now on the faculty, and Gabenga Adesina, a poet, talking about Saraba magazine. It's out. The next Quixote talk will happen Thursday, November 9th, with a short film by Alex Fatal and a discussion between the filmmaker and Michael Tausig. And on December 7th, Susan Bernofsky will talk about her work as translator and biographer of the Swiss writer Robert Walser and his art writings, and also the microscripts. Susan Sontag called Walser the missing link between Kleist and Kafka, and he was much admired by Walter Benjamin, Robert Musil, and Kafka. Art Writing is also co-hosting an event next Tuesday, October 17th, with the SVA Department of Design, Research, Writing, and Criticism. The architect and artist Alan Wexler will speak about his new book, Absurd Thinking Between Art and Design, and that happens next door in 136 on the second floor from 6:30 to 8:30. Now I give you Emmanuel.
I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes just smiling, and it's wonderful to be here and to see so many people I love and admire, and I'm kind of very nervous at this point, so if I say anything that doesn't make sense, just kind of fill in the gap. But it's really exciting to be doing this here because, you know, as I guess everyone knows, this is my second home. I graduated from here. I now teach here, and it's kind of been my life in New York, actually. And this is the second or third time I'm giving a talk here, so I feel like I'll always be finding an excuse to do something here. But particularly, Saraba is a project that I guess many people in New York that know me don't know about, really, because it's a project that was launched 9 years ago in Nigeria, and by the time I came here, I'd been doing it for about, I think, 5 years at the time, and this is the first time we're doing a print issue, so that's very special, and I think you are very special to be part of the launch here in New York. Last week, October 2nd, we did a launch in London, and then sometime next month in Nigeria, we'll do another launch. So it's kind of this model of trying to proliferate the world with Saraba. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and if you haven't seen it, this is it. This is what we're talking about today. And I have with me one of the contributors to the issue, Gbenga Adesina, who is going to read from the poems in the issue, but also new poems. But I felt like it's important, and you see in the slides just past issues of the magazine and some photographs from some of the issues. Just keep rolling while I talk. But the first question I want to address is the idea of Saraba. What is the meaning of Saraba? And there's a simple answer and a slightly more involved one. In the simpler version, we took the name from a poem a friend of ours had written, and in the other version, there are at least 3 meanings. So depending on whether you're from Japan, Senegal, Gambia, or if you speak Hausa or Kiswahili. And the story is that when we started Saraba, we were looking for a name that sounded African, as you do when you're trying to sound African. And a friend of ours, as I said, had written this poem that had a glossolalia, so he just came up with this idea of Larry, Kori, Saraba. And once, while my friend and I, who I co-founded the magazine with, we were standing just chatting, this guy walks up, and immediately we see him, we say, Saraba, and that's how the name came to be. And immediately we bought the domain name. We started thinking, okay, people would ask us what this thing means. And And so we had to start Googling for the meaning of Saraba. Um, and the first answer was some kind of intractable thing in Japanese that, I can't even remember what it means. And so if anyone asks us, what does Saraba mean? We say it means togetherness in Japanese. But then in 2015, I was in Senegal, and I met with a writer, the renowned writer Boubacar Boris Diop, and he was very curious about Saraba. He was very interested in the ethos of the magazine and what we had been doing, and he asked me, what's the meaning of that thing? What's the meaning of this magazine? And I gave the same answer, I don't know. It means anything you call it. And he said, well, in Senegal, the idea of Saraba is the idea of utopia, right? And then last week when I was in Bristol, a guy who is also from the Senegambia, like from the region of Senegal and Gambia, said to me, in that part of the world, we associate Saraba with a sense of a gathering of tribes, so 1,000 tribes coming together in this utopic place. That's what Saraba means. And I said, well, that's a new meaning. And then someone else in the audience at that workshop last week said to me, Saraba in Kiswahili, pronounced differently, not as Saraba, but something like Salaba or something like that, means the cross. And so by now we have at least 5 meanings of Saraba. But the range of meanings, in relation to Saraba has always, for me, indicated the central conceits of the magazine and the metaphorical reach of our ambitions. How do we build a literary publication out of Nigeria when, as undergraduates, we scarcely had models for the kind of work we hope to do? This was 2008, and the only literary magazine out of Nigeria at the time, and the one we hoped to get published in, was Farafina, which was published at the time by a book publisher of the same name. And in 2009, right around the time Saraba was founded, they went on a terminal hiatus. At the time, they said, we are just going on a hiatus, we'll figure out how to come back. But from then until now, Farafina hasn't come back. And in thinking about, what our mission is, and this idea that as undergraduates, we are starting out as writers also, and thinking about how we could promote our work, the details has changed in the way we articulate our mission. So we now think about, especially now that some of our writers and contributors have become renowned, writers, and they're well known, they're published. So it's no longer the impulse to simply publish for the first time. The essentials are still the same idea of thinking about how new writing is produced in Nigeria, and equally in the rest of the continent, and how writers can be supported by a serious literary magazine at the outset of their careers. So even though Saraba's kind of evolved, and I can't even get published in Saraba anymore, it's atrocious, I shouldn't do that. We are still thinking about writers who have never really gotten published in a major literary publication. And so, I can't get published in Saraba, for instance, although, when we started the first 4 issues, you always see my name and Dami's name, who I co-founded the magazine with. But now it's just, how do we offer other writers who maybe they've even gotten published online, but they haven't been given the kind of attention that they should be given at the outset of their careers? So how do you work with such seriousness, that can, especially when you're beginning as a writer, you need an editor to say to you, even if you get 500 retweets, it doesn't mean that you're writing well, right? And what kind of seriousness can you bring to your work at the outset of your career that can help you produce better work? But I think it's kind of important because Damia Ajayi, I should say, he was supposed to be here, but he's actually in Massachusetts this night because he has to give a talk tomorrow on Saraba. And he has written a very brilliant talk, actually, for that event. And I want to read a few paragraphs that kind of gives you a sense of how Saraba came to be. And I should apologize in advance because I'll be referring to myself in third person. So in the summer of 2008, three undergraduate students of the Obafemi Awolowo University, Ile-Ife, organized a 3-day program, which they ambitiously called the Colloquium of New Writing. This auspicious event, the first of its kind in Ile-Ife, was captioned with an even more ambitious subtitle, Write, Connect, Publish. I was a 400-level medical student at the time. This is Dami speaking, by the way. I noticed these posters pasted generously on the wall of my faculty, and I was interested in participating. The poster instructed interested participants to send a sample of their writing to a designated email address. I was so excited that I compiled a few poems and emailed them to the address that night. I was an aspiring writer then. I had penned poems since age 11. I was 22 years old, and I had written no less than 500 unpublished poems. At this time, some of my poems had appeared in the occasional newspaper or an obscure website, but I knew I was not yet the kind of writer I longed to be. In retrospect, the Colloquium of New Writing changed my life. It brought me in contact with Emmanuel Iduma, Ato Anyaduba, and Ayobami Adebayo, fellow undergraduate students of Ife I had not known prior to the Colloquium. This is the story of how the Colloquium led to Saraba magazine. After the Colloquium, Iduma and I would run into each other usually on Mondays at the English department. The magnet that pulled us to this place, the wooden boards on which were posted the juvenile writings of student journalists and writers. Soon enough, these meetings were moved to Sunday evenings, when I visited Iduma at his father's residence, who was the chaplain at the university chapel. The Sunday meetings paid off because I always got a free meal. Iduma and I would discuss the novels, poems, and essays we were reading in his father's library filled with Christian literature. We were both interested in Nigerian writing in English, from Amos Tutuola to Adichie. We conceived Saraba and Iduma's father's study. This is weird, we conceived Saraba and Iduma's father's study one evening in November 2008. We had been amassing rejection slips of poems, essays, and short stories sent to literary magazines based mostly in the West. That was where our impulse to start publishing came from. It was a eureka moment for a selfish impulse. The idea was simple: float a literary magazine, compile entries to which ours were added and published. The logistics seemed manageable: to buy a domain name, to host a website, to have submissions edited, to design a magazine, to publish in PDF format, to upload on the website. We were thrilled by our idea because it, most importantly, meant that we would be published. The real excitement was seeing our name in digital print. We brainstormed for a motto and came up with this: creating unending voices. We designed a logo of a man blowing trumpets. So I think the next thing to talk about, and that's the end of Dami's part of the speech, because he was supposed to be here. But one of the things I've been thinking about in relation to presenting this magazine today is actually the work I did with my friend Sean Randall, who is here, and which culminated in this book. I promise you I'm promoting the book, but that's not the only thing I'm promoting tonight. And I think out of the work I had been doing for Saraba came, Gambit's New African Writing. The book of short stories and interviews that had up to 9 writers from different parts of the continent. And now that I reflect on it, all but one of the 9 contributors and interviewees were past contributors to the magazine. The ideological basis of Gambit and Saraba is very similar, and perhaps even the same. So I want to read you just a few paragraphs from the introduction I wrote in 2014. So if my writing doesn't sound good enough, I wrote it 3 years ago. And so the subtitle for this book was Newer African Writing. And by this time, there were a lot of conversations about what it meant to be published as an African writer. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with those conversations. Where do you get published? The conversations, or the distinctions rather, between home-based writers and writers who were writing from the diaspora. At the time, I perpetuated some of the problematic ways of thinking about these distinctions, but now I have a slightly evolved relationship with the idea because, of course, I'm based in New York at this point. And my friends in Nigeria are probably saying that this guy has sold out. to the West. So I was thinking at the time actually of the idea of newer. What does it mean to say that this book, for instance, but also the work that Saraba had been doing, because we're thinking about new writers, emerging writers. How do you think about the idea of the new or the idea of newer? And I wrote that by formulating newer, I affirm that the new is still being unraveled. I play into the notion that there was a renewed interest in African writing sometime in the early 2000s, the founding of the Kane Prize in 2001 possibly instigating this curiosity. As African writers began to receive acclaim from Western literary institutions and given the authority of these institutions, territories were delineated. On one side were writers established by virtue of the acclaim they received, and on the other were writers yet unrecognized. This second group I termed emerging. Emerging is problematic because it suggests there is a standard of success that writers tagged as such aim to attain. It's almost predictable what manner of success the writer could have: to be shortlisted for the Kane Prize and to sign a contract with a reputable London or New York-based agency, then another contract with the publisher who would buy the rights for everywhere except Africa. When the book is released, it is praised by acclaimed critics, then perhaps another major award, the Man Booker Prize or the Orange Prize. Nothing, of course, is wrong with recognition in this manner, and drawing attention to how this is a potential stereotype for success does not begrudge the writers of their achievements. Regardless, I speculate that there are alternative ways to draw attention to and affirm the visibility of writers who are based in their home countries. This is the central impulse of my work with Gambit, and I would say with Saraba. That most of the writers whose work receives international acclaim live and teach outside the continent, and now I can include myself in that category, is indicative of how visibility in the literary world works. What is the politics of visibility in relation to home-based African writing? In general, this inquiry has something to do with how books are distributed, how magazines are distributed, and the socio-economic character of an African country's readership. It is hardly questionable from a market point of view that to be published while being based at home is to operate from the fringes of the literary world's acclaim. So enough of my ideology. I want to talk about the work very briefly that Saraba has done so far, because I think that the real success for us will be measured by how we can sort of move forward from here. But to give you some perspective, one of the things that has been most fascinating to me about running Saraba for the last 9 years has been the fact that suddenly you realize that you're some kind of establishment, right? And that's very weird to think because, nobody makes money from this thing. And we are not an institution in the sense of a magazine like, say, Granta or the New Yorker. But there is a sense that if you've done something for that long, if you've kind of sustained your thinking around a particular project, literary project, then you've become some kind of establishment. And I remember the moment that this occurred to me, and I say this often because it was actually a real moment. I was in Nairobi as part of a panel discussion, and someone asked, so now that you guys have become part of the literary establishment in Africa, how do you ensure that you accept people who are still up and coming? That the question went like that, and I said, oh, we are establishment, we're actually just starting out. This is just 7 years at a time, and we don't think that we've come to the place where we can think of ourselves in that way. But I think that, after doing about 35 publications in all, and that's some of the covers that you're seeing, which includes about 23 themed issues and 11 poetry chapbooks and 5 special issues, and having almost 300 individual contributors, some of whom are winners or shortlistees of acclaimed literary prizes, including the Kane Prize, of course, Bailey's Women Prize for Fiction, Etisalat Prize for Literature, the Brunel International African Poetry Prize, and the NLNG Nigeria Prize for Literature. There's a sense in which when you have all of those credentials, people begin to take you extra serious. But for me, the real milestone, I would say, is persistence. And that persistence is kind of linked to the precarious nature of our lives as editors. So to give you some perspective, I'm the editor, and which is kind of like this weird designation. And we have 4 other senior editors, and we have 5 assistant editors, and we're all based in all parts of, like in Nigeria. One of us is in South Korea now. One of us is kind of roving between Nigeria and the UK. One is in Canada. So to have this sort of like, our lives are still unfolding, right? So my life as a writer is kind of still unfolding, still at the outset. And then to think about how Saraba is this kind of establishment is already problematic for me. But I think that despite all of that, despite the seismic changes in our lives as editors and as writers, the sense of continuity that Saraba has is the real milestone, right? And I think that is really linked to the fact that we are all friends. And we started this as undergraduates when we were thinking very seriously of pursuing literary careers. And being writers ourselves, growing the magazine meant we had to improve the quality of our own work. Because I have this nightmare that, people would, finally Google me outside Saraba and find that I can't write. And I don't want that to happen. And improving the quality of our work as writers has had a direct effect on the quality of work that we publish. So the final question that I want to ask before I introduce the magazine is, what does it mean to pitch forward in relation to Saraba? In the last day or two, I've really been thinking about the peculiarity of an African literary magazine in relation to other magazines in the US or UK. Of course, there's the same kind of precarious situation, which is, the questions around the longevity of print, how long would print last, whether the internet is taking over the world, whether the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse will finally decide that the end of the world is near. And I'm talking about Zuckerberg, Bezos, and the 2 Google guys. But I think that there's certainly a kind of distinction that can be made between building a literary institution in both parts of the world. So what does it mean to build a literary institution out of the African continent versus building a literary institution, say, out of New York? If, I speak with a lot of editors who run publications here, and they're all faced with the same kind of question, right? How do we continue work in a kind of climate that doesn't encourage this kind of rigorous thinking? But I think there's a sense in which, for instance, if you're running a magazine like one of my favorites, Triple Canopy, you have some kind of resources to pull from. You have a sense that there's some kind of cultural capital that can foster your work. Whereas if you're running a magazine out of Nigeria, you first of all have to deal with the question of education. And people would ask you, who is reading this thing, Can people read? Can people read the quality of work that you produce? In a sense, you have to both play the role of a publisher of a magazine and the Ministry of Education, in a sense, right? You have to figure out how people can read this thing, apart from even figuring out how you can put out the work. But I think that every time I think about Saraba, I feel that to pitch forward in relation to the magazine is to develop a model that survives any of the founding editors. And I really cannot say for now what that model is. It's still something we are thinking about. And even if the increased demands on our personal writing life does not diminish our commitment to the magazine, which is a real fear, by the way, the ultimate success would be to sustain the magazine's argument for, at the very minimum, 50 years. And given this, how does the themes that we choose and the way in which the magazine is edited and designed reflect the peculiar ways in which literature enlarges our understanding of the African and human experience? So this is now what I'm obsessed with. How do we present a publication both online and in print that reflects some kind of peculiarity about the African experience in a way that a magazine like, say, M+1 would not? So this is our first print issue, which mine is rough now. And it was called Transitions for a number of reasons. One is, just to gesture to the idea of moving from online into print, but also to think about, journeys, my favorite theme in the world, travel, movement. And we have about 16 contributors to this issue, including writers who contributed short stories, essays, and even photographs. So I'm going to just read from the editorial note, just like a couple of paragraphs to give you a sense of what is here. Our difference to paper, if that's what our first print issue suggests, comes from an early impulse to treat the magazine as an aesthetic object, so the reader dives into something of beauty, a lingering touch, a returned gaze, and a felt presence. We hope to publish at least one print issue yearly. The idea, as we have done here, is to anthologize new writing squarely on the premise of promise, as though this is a document with which readers might return to understand how the featured contributors have prospered in their calling as writers. Transitions. The photographs included illuminate the theme, lines abstracted from Lagos architecture, and faces pictured during the photographer's first visit to Lagos, faces mostly glancing away. In collaboration with the artist-led project Invisible Borders, which I worked with for a couple of years, we have published excerpts from 2 travel essays written after a recent road trip within Nigeria. So I think it's I have the singular honor of having one of the contributors, because we're all kind of far-flung around the world, Gbenga Adesina, and he's going to read from some of his poems that are included in the issue, and I think a few new poems. And let me introduce Gbenga, because it's some kind of star, actually. Gbenga Adesina, who was Nigerian-born poet and essayist, jointly won the 2016 Brunel African Poetry Prize. His poem, How to Paint a Girl, was selected by Matthew Zapruder for its clarity of observation and empathetic insight into the suffering of another for the New York Times. He was a 2016 Norman Mailer Poetry Fellow at Pepperdine University, Malibu, California. He received scholarships and residencies from Fine Arts Work Center, Provincetown, and the Open Society Foundation in Gorée Island, off the coast of Senegal. His poetry chapbook, Painter of Water, was published by African Poetry Book Fund and Akashic Books, New York, in a series edited by Kwame Dawes and Chris Obani. His poems have appeared or forthcoming in Parashuna, Brittle Paper, Vinyl, Plowshares, and elsewhere. His poetry manuscript, Holy Bodies, was a finalist for the 2017 Sillerman First Book Prize. He's a Starworks Fellow at NYU, where he's also teaching undergraduate poetry. So join me in welcoming Gbenga Adesina.
Yeah, so I'm going to read some newish poems, then I'll read the poems from here. So Americans like to say water. In Nigeria, we say water. So if I say water, you know what I mean, water. Yeah. Okay. This is called, so I write a lot about love, and it's going to feel like church. I run away from church. Okay. Can you guys hear me? Okay, good. Thank you. Is it good? Oh, okay. Oh, so now it feels like preaching again. So I write a lot about love and loss, moving between the two themes. So this is called Infinitely Less Alone. Infinitely less alone. Your hands in the small place of bones where they meet mine. Shore of skin, slow fall, a small fluster of miraculous music. Love's vast colony of hunger. The map lines crackle, the run in my maplewood veins. I would that you know what is eating is what is broken, is what is holy. The love you give to me will set me free. So I must turn towards the wine dark wind, its offering of rain and evanescence, and a grief summoned from a dearest place. My loss is a loss with doors. It opens. Thank you. So I'm trying hard not to read sad poems, so I don't know. So this is called Skite, like a sickle, skite, blade, something like that. Skite. Plum plucked from a burning. Skite. Silence. Nights that are also knives. Can I ask that you please do not cut me tonight? The secret is to say, I am not alone. I am not alone. When it's just me and the dark in the room, and even the dark would rather be elsewhere. Skite. Silence. Cities that run away from you and return as a door. Skite. Silence. Please give me back to myself. Okay, so this one's called Ode to What I Do Not Know. The poem is an ode, but it's not an ode to rain or to sunshine or to buttons or to tomatoes like Pablo Neruda, okay? This is an ode to what I do not know. Two animals, doe-hide, sleek across the road into the femur of the night. Their feet learn the reptile skin of hurt, dark roots, the tethering of dreams. I wake up away from myself. The fast animals of my eyes crouch through tickets and the sky-colored beach where I suddenly look up and see that my tongue is a country of birds. This water twists like a snake to taste itself. Water says, I have never tasted of myself. I do not know myself. On a morning radio show about lines and color, a man called in. There was a child howling in the house of his mouth. He said, please listen to me, please. I'm prejudiced. His voice cracked. I need help. What spilled out of the stereo laid on my floor, breathing? It had falls, dark, Lord, the fizz of it. Some nights I wake up panting, knowing that I'm a stranger with accent, homeless in the childhood country of my body. Some nights I clench my fist, my teeth. I try hard to not turn on my bed. I fear what lives in me might spill out and darken the floor. A knife, not silence, sliced through us. What is loss, if not your body, refusing to give you back to yourself? Okay, so I'm going to read a poem that hopefully is not as sad as the other ones. So in a way, this is supposed to be my breakthrough poem, except that I don't know what breakthrough poem means. This is called How to Paint a Girl. And it's sort of funny that Emmanuel was talking about what it means to live outside the country and, the dichotomy, the West and Nigeria or Africa. And as young writers or young would-be writers in Nigeria, we used to have those conversations and debates about selling out to the West, We would check the writer's book and the blob, to see if this person is still very loyal to the country or to the continent, or if this person has started making money from the other side. So last year, May, I grew up in the cities, but as at this time, I was living in a very small town called Abeokuta. I was doing a master's program, and I was deliberately living there, like a rebel child. I'd left a banking job to the shock and dismay of my father. It was sort of funny. My father was a banker. The man who got him the job many, many years ago, my uncle, was the one who got me my home banking job, right? So I sort of thought, isn't this crazy? This uncle who got my father his job is still around, don't hold, is getting me this job in Lagos. Like, is this what I'm going to do with my life? So my father said, I know you want to be a writer. Look at me, I'm a writer in a way. I'm like, no, Dad, you're not a writer. He said, you can do the job for like 3 years, and then you write a little, you can take a break. It was just finding a way to make me do the job. So I left, and it was like mad. So the truth was that I would go to Abeokuta and do a master's program. He said he would pay for it, but that would be the last thing he would pay for. And I would make a distinction so that I would get a scholarship for PhD. My dad would plan all of those things. He called them family meetings, You would sit down, you guys would sit down with a pen, you would say, okay, so this is my idea, what's your own idea? Yeah, I completely understood him. He thought the country was tough and difficult. The country could swallow you up and make you mad if you don't find a way to do something. So anyway, I'm in Abeokuta, I'm doing this master's program, and I'm making distinctions, right? And he would call me and said, how's it going? I'm like, fine, I'm on distinction. What else do you want? But I was writing. That was what I was doing. I was writing crazily. And he knew that was what I was doing, that it wasn't about this master's program. Anyway, I'm in Abeokuta, and I get a mail that Matthew Sapruda, who was the poetry editor of New York Times, would like to publish my poem in the New York Times. So I quickly emailed Kwame Dawes, who was my editor, like, is this a scam? Because it doesn't make sense. I wasn't even sending out poems. Why would anybody want to publish me in the New York Times? So I said, no, Benga, this is real. So I was in Abeokuta, right? And that happened. And I wasn't going to read this poem, but yesterday we had a master's class at the NYU program, and Matthew Sapruda was the guest. And I sat in front, and he kept looking at me like, do I know you? So after the event, I said, yeah, you published this poem. I was like, oh, I'm happy I did. What are you doing here? I'm like, yeah, I'm here now. And anyway, I read the poem. I hope it's not as terrible as I thought it was. So just read it. How to Paint a Girl. With him, you come to learn that when a man is called to paint a girl, he paints all of himself. His tiny songs are the floss in her hair. The tulips on her blouse are the stories his sisters told him on the half nights long ago in the lost country of music. With their half falls and follicles and buds and brown twigs that speak more of withering things. The tiny sigh, the one you almost didn't see, the silence in our eyes, is the night his mother died while he fought rebels in the Nigerian army. Yeah, that's that. If I have 1 more minute or 2, okay, good. So because I wanted to buy this magazine, so anytime I go for readings in New York, I shamelessly market my child books. I say, this is New York, the city of capitalism. I mean, why not? So I'm just going to read you one poem. So my father died last year, a few months before my child book came out. And I said I wasn't going to write about it, but since then, anytime I try to write, it's about him I write. So some of the poems here are obviously about him, okay? This is called Swal, in memoriam of Essay. I walked into the room, and you're supposed to look at the body, and it didn't look like the body, They say this is not the body. The body is a hum on a tree. It is camwood, carnation. They wrap white shawl around what is saying. They say this is not the body. I walk out of the room into the ignorance of light that does not reveal. Black ravens whoosh across the sky like a country of rain. I look for my father in the swirl. Thank you guys so much.
I would love for you to speak about how you've been, I guess, a beneficiary of the PLS work that Chris Abani and Kwame Dawes have done. They run this thing called the African Poetry Book Fund. And I think since 2013, if I'm not mistaken, around that time. And it's probably like 5 books or 7 books a year. And the goal is to sort of do like this, produce something significant out of, a body of work out of contemporary African poetry. So how has that project been important for you, and where do you think it's headed?
Thank you. I think what it do is to sort of make writing poetry sort of cool and maybe sexy again in Nigeria. So when you write poetry, there's this fun part about, I'm in the poetry program at NYU. After our classes, we gather downstairs at the lounge and sort of poke fun at the guys in the fiction program, because they sort of look important. They carry themselves without panache and understanding. And I say, why not? Some of those guys are going to be pretty famous, So we, the poetry guys, are like, yeah, if we're lucky, we will have a friend who is teaching high school, and maybe we invite us over. And if they don't have funds, we'll maybe do a Skype call, We're just totally in love and in resolution with our obscurity. So in Nigeria, when I was in high school and then university, and I had these friends and we were writing poems, you write poems knowing that they would never be published. You would never be Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. There was a total resolve. I couldn't even emphasize that you would publish. So when Kwame Dawes and Chris Abani started to do these chapbooks, it was a platform of possibility. All of a sudden, your books could get published. You could win things. There's also the Brunel Prize, right? You could win £3,000 for writing poems in Abeokuta. It was unbelievable. It was the idea is that you need time to write, to dream, to do these crazy things. But also as a young adult, you need to walk the fine line between social currency and not going insane and having time to keep doing this thing. So what it did I like to joke to myself that what Chris Abani and Kwame Dawes did for me was to give me 5 years where my mom would not feel so sad about me. I could show her some things. My mom came to me and said, these things you've always been writing, how much will it cost for us to publish them? Yeah, she knew that these things were important and nothing was happening. So when Chris and Kwame said we were publishing and they sent me the front cover, so I showed it to my mom and said, look at that, it's coming out. And she said, are we going to pay? I said, no, it's free. So in a way, you could now write poetry, you could now dream about writing poetry and have some tangible things to show for it. Mm-hmm. And of course, in the West, it means that you could encounter poetry. Anytime people meet me and I say I write poems and I'm from Nigeria, they're like, wow, do you know Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie? Like there's no model, there's no formula for writing poetry.
We should all be Adichie.
Yeah, we should all be Adichie. So what they're doing is sort of inventing this new model. So maybe in about 20 years' time, young African poets could have models for how to write poetry coming from Africa.
Okay, I think that's enough from us. Yeah. Don't you think? Yeah. Okay. So I would like to open it up to questions and for us to just have a conversation really about Saraba, which, by the way, is being sold for $10. I think that's a good price, yeah? Don't you think? So everyone should get a copy. But also about, some of the things that Benga has raised and really not, maybe my personal life I can give you. No. But I think that for the magazine, in terms of the logistics of producing this publication, we have editors who are based in Nigeria as well. So there's a sense that it's not even a question of authenticity. That is not a question for us. What does it mean to write in a way that is authentically African? I think that has been solved a millennia ago. But the question is, how do we solicit for new writing that is happening within Nigeria, within the African continent. And I think that we sort of have the means to do that because, we are part of a larger network of African writing. So even if I'm based in New York, for instance, I know more of the writers I know actually who are African writers. I know a lot of them from Nigeria or from the rest of the African continent. So there is no disconnect, especially because the internet makes this kinds of connection possible, right? So there is actually an African literary Twitter, if I'll call it that, or an African literary Facebook, because there is sort of this connectedness that regardless of where you are, especially if you're within the continent, you can access resources, you can access opportunities. So it didn't really affect Gbenga's prospects that he was based in Abeokuta to tap into the resources that Chris Abani and Commodores had created in the U.S. So that's on the logistical side of things. But the larger question of I guess what it means to be based away and doing a publication that is intended, quote unquote, for Africa. For me, I answer it simply that I'm thinking about Nigeria squarely in the diasporic sense. And I don't mean that merely in the sense of being away from Nigeria physically, but what does it mean that, for instance, because Nigeria is a country that has many ethnicities, people are always moving. So the very idea of Nigeria, the very idea of Africa, if we were going to be serious about thinking about it in a generous way, is based on the idea of reaching out to the stranger, reaching out to the other. So it's always a question of movement. It's always a question of the diaspora, regardless of whether you're based within the continent or outside of it. Because we are not necessarily a periodical, it's hard to sort of be on top of news or be on top of topical issues. So what we always do is to sort of propose a theme that can accommodate all kinds of ideas and possibilities. So when we say transitions, we know that this issue doesn't necessarily only include things that, travel stories, for instance. It can also include, poems about his dad's transition into the afterlife or dealing with the fact that his dad is no longer with us, So for us, the theme is always meant to be some kind of metaphorical leap, if I can say that, just like how can you propose something that writers can have enough room to play with. So when we say to you, when we make a call and we say the next issue is, for instance, viral, which is actually a thing we are playing with. So the idea of viral, the idea of going viral, the idea of even, for instance, bringing a public health specialist to write something around the aftermath of the Ebola crisis, for instance. Just one. So it's how do you kind of propose a metaphor, really, that writers can play around with. So I would say that it's really not topical, although we are kind of playing around with the idea of getting someone in government to write for our next issue. That's, one of the contributors to one of our earlier issues, Donald Molosi, who you probably have heard of, he's based in Botswana now. Yeah, Joy Mogami. And so I could introduce you to all of these people. And I think that one of the real success for me of Saraba so far is that because we are based primarily on the internet, we've been able to receive submissions from all parts of the continent. Okay. All parts of the continent. And practice holding this. All parts of the continent. And, it's really that, especially because Saraba has sort of grown in ways that we didn't anticipate. We sort of have links to, really a lot of countries in the continent, yeah. And I'm very happy to pass on the information, yeah. Because, we face the real challenge of dealing with decolonizing, very simply. But for Saraba, I think one of the reasons why we started saying, we publish writing out of Nigeria first and then the rest of the African continent is to actually be able to focus on a certain locality, in a sense. So how do we, the idea that the particular can contain the universal, actually that's something that Ngugi Wa Thiong'o said that the particular can contain the universal. So when we begin to think in terms of what Nigerian literature is, what its capacities are, I think that it helps us propose, in a sense, a model for hopefully the rest of the continent. So to give you an example, in 2011 first, we collaborated with the Poetry Translation Center in the UK to publish one of our poetry chapbooks, which was called The World Salad. And the idea was to publish poems in translation and in English from different parts of the world. And that was the first, part of a two-part project. Where the next year, 2 years later, actually, we brought together writing from minor Nigerian languages. So folklore, what we call the ways of the Nigerian folk. And we decided not to publish writing or literature written in Hausa, Yoruba, or Igbo. That's the major languages in Nigeria, and to instead work with minor languages. And I think we had about 22 of those languages. So the idea at the end of the day was to say, how is it possible to think about literature in a country like Nigeria when we sidestep the major languages? So it's always an unfinished conversation, actually, in relation to language. And more than anything, it's really there's so much work that has to be done. First of all, in thinking about how we can do unheard of things, as Achebe said, with the English language. But then secondly, how we can open up, say, Nigerian literature so that it doesn't simply become Anglophone. It can also become, say, Yoruba phone. Yeah, or Igbo phone. Yeah. How can we publish more Arabic, for instance? Yeah. Maybe like 80% of the content in this new issue are by women. And that was a eureka moment for me. I remember thinking about what kind of content would publish for this and speaking with the editors about it. And it became almost an obsession to say, Saraba has not really done enough in answering that question. And, just because how many submissions in the first place, and this is not even an excuse, right? It goes to the amount of submissions you get. And sometimes you finished thinking about who you're going to publish before you realize that 70% are by men, and then you can't do anything. So because we had the opportunity to commission, it was very important that we said, okay, we're going to publish more women for the first time in any issue, and more and more it's becoming more important to me that we figure out a way to. And I don't, there's a way in which you can answer this, and it's just like, just make part comments about how Saraba hopes to include more women. But it's very important to me, and I can't even overemphasize that. And I think now, because we have this policy to commission at least half of the content for any issue, it's even more important that we look out specifically for women writers from not just Nigeria, of course, but the rest of the continent. So I don't know if that answers your question, but just gives you a sense of where we are now and what we are hoping to do. So, so far, there is no model. No, there is a model, I'll tell you. But in the sense that in the last 8 years, most of what we've published is available for free online. Right, so already you know what the problem is, that if you're publishing online, if you release it for free, because we kind of design as PDF, so there's already a sense of like making an object or a digital object. It's really intensive, because you're going through drafts, you're copy editing as you would do in a physical publication, only that you don't actually go to press. So it's something that we've always been thinking about, and I think we've sort of arrived at a sweet spot now, where first of all, this is for sale, so that means there's some kind of cash flow, right? But secondly, we've also come to the point where we can apply for grants, for instance, in Nigeria. So we are registered as a non-profit in Nigeria, which means that even if we're writing to organizations not necessarily based in Nigeria, they can take us seriously. And so we got our first grant in 2015 when we ran a manuscript project. And actually, that's even what helped us from saving from those, that grant to be able to do this first print issue. But now we are getting, interestingly, we are getting organizations say to us, can we collaborate on a workshop, for instance? So I think the added visibility of, having writers like Ayobami Adebayo, whose, breakout novel just came, breakthrough novel, is that how you say breakthrough? Breakthrough, who has a first novel out and is really doing well. So people will be interested in, for instance, hearing her in a workshop setting. And she's an editor of Saraba. She's one of the founding editors. So that can, if we collaborate with institutions, for instance, to say, can you give us the funds to organize something, then some of those funds can go into producing an issue. So, the sense that I'm having now is that while the work that a magazine would do in terms of the issues will be fixed, 3 or 4 issues a year, we can also be smart about how we leverage on our networks as editors to make sure that there is some money coming into the organization. And I think this is just the early stages of figuring that out, because this is the first time that we actually have a cash flow, after 9 years, which is very weird. Yeah. No, this is the first of hopefully 50 more print issues. That's kind of some weird threshold, actually, because I watched this documentary, the 50-year argument on the New York Review of Books, and that's just became a good metaphor for me. So Saraba is a 50-year argument. And what we plan to do is to have 1 print issue a year, and sort of to have online, to keep doing what we've been doing, publish PDFs, right? And then kind of fold into like a print issue towards the end of the year, just as we've done. And the model is simple. We don't, and I'll give you all the secrets. We don't have like the kind of resources to produce thousands of copies, right, for instance. And what we've started doing, and that's why you're here, is to organize events through our network, So we've done 3 events in London, for instance, and we're doing one here, and we'll do 2 in Nigeria in November. And because we are based, so we have an editor in Nigeria, and actually next year we'll do one in Canada. And the idea is to just proliferate like that, so people who get to attend the events can at least pick up the copies. So that's one thing we're doing now, and let's see how it goes. Yeah, the first thing is that it's just hard to carry, It's like moving this thing from across, the Atlantic is hard. So that's one problem. But I think in the more positive sense, just seeing, because we've always been interested in how the magazine is designed. That's something that, although, we're very minimalist oriented, font-based, as my friend said, but to think about what kind of cover do we want to have? How do we want the magazine to look? How many pages is it going to be? Is it 10 by 7, 7 by 10, 10 by 10? All of those questions immediately occur to you when you're going to print something. But also, how do we work with illustrators and photographers, for instance, in how the issue eventually, what's inside the issue. So if we commission, for instance, an illustrator for the cover, that's a different kind of process than if we were doing a PDF issue. Usually what we'll do is to ask for permission to reproduce. But this time around, because we are hopefully making something that is in some ways exclusive, we then think about the art in a different way. So there are all these variables that suddenly occur to you. Of course, that's why it takes a lot of time to produce something like this. And I think that ultimately I feel a sense of even indebtedness to Saraba, that I can then become attentive to these details, I don't think I've ever been passionate about Saraba the way I am now. And really, it's because we are doing this printing, where I suddenly have to start calculating the numbers and, figuring out how to convince people to buy it. And so, there's just the sense that you have something, your body's oriented in a different way, if I can put it that way. In terms of Saraba itself, I don't think we've done much with that, to be honest, because there's a sense in which we've been insulated by, no, not insulated, we've kind of been killed over in relation to the amount of work that we have to do within Nigeria and the continent. And actually, I'll think about this some more, but I think that, for instance, the Arcade Book Festival, and it's very important in many ways, because at this point it's one of the, the best festivals around, and people come from around the world. And one of the reasons why it's important for Saraba, for instance, to make a presence there is that you're not simply talking about African literature on, let's say, continental level, but you're talking about in a more enhanced manner, So if writers, one of the things we've always done is that if writers come from any part of the world, we're always interested in how can we work together. How can we, if you run an organization, how can we even co-produce, an issue? So for instance, and this is a bad example actually, now that I think about it, but in 2015 we worked with one of the pavilions at the Venice Biennale to produce a special issue, and it was the German pavilion. But that's a model for me actually in thinking about how, if, for instance, we are asked to collaborate with an organization from the Global South, would say, yeah, how do we, facilitate an exchange? Another instance is that earlier this year we worked with an organization, a literary publication actually based in Cameroon, to produce an exchange project. And so what happened is that writers from Nigeria traveled to Cameroon, and at this year's Arcade Festival, writers from Cameroon would travel to Nigeria for, for a kind of a conversation between them. And I think that that's really a model that we can use, hopefully, with you. Yeah, I think my friends who I run the magazine with give me a lot of freedom in terms of the images, because there's always a sense that you're the one who is doing that art thing, so just figure out the but I mean, in the earlier years of the magazine, we're always just looking for illustrators whose work was appealing to us, and writing them the weird email saying, please, we are a literary magazine, humble origins in Nigeria, can you give us your work for free? And almost everyone was generous. There was one bad situation though, but we're delivered by the mighty hand of God, because this guy kept thinking that we had stolen his work, and after he had agreed, actually. But apart from that, we haven't really had issues with illustrators and photographers, because we just think about their work in relation to a team, for instance, and say, can you give us your work to, include in the magazine? But this is slightly different. I mean, with the print issue, as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of different now, where we are consciously thinking about new work, So we want to be the first, especially for the print issue, to publish or to to showcase or exhibit any visual work. And I could go on a tangent and talk about the relationship between text and image, but there's no time for that. But for me, it's just a sense that the images must never serve to merely illustrate the text, and kind of vice versa. So how do you open up a space for visual artists to, play, but also knowing that this is a literary publication? So this is not necessarily, in the strict sense of it, an arts publication. This is a literary publication. The audience are people who would read short stories or novels, or poems, and how can you use the work that is presented visually to sort of resonate with the text that is published. Okay, thank you very much. I think you've been a generous audience.